What if the crime of the century wasn't as open and shut as we were told? A national hero, a missing child, a ransom paid, a body was found, and a man was sent to the electric chair. But nearly a century later, the questions won't die. Was justice served, or was the truth buried with it? This is the story of the Lindbergh Kidnapping, a case full of mystery, missteps, and theories that still shake America's faith in justice. Charles Lindbergh was one of the most recognizable figures in the world during the early 20th century. In 1927, he became the first person to fly solo nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean, a feat that made him an international hero overnight. His name appeared in newspapers across continents, and his face was printed on the covers of magazines. To many, he wasn't just a famous pilot. He was a symbol of progress and daring in a fast-changing world. By the early 1930s, Lindbergh had settled into family life with his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh. Anne came from a wealthy, well-connected family and was a writer in her own right. Together, they lived in Hopewell, New Jersey, in a large, quiet house surrounded by woods. Their home was secluded, set back from the road, giving them the privacy that suited their growing family. In 1930, the couple welcomed their first child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The Lindberghs may have been seen as America's golden couple, but on the night of March 1st, 1932, everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening and the household had settled down for the night. Charles Jr., a 20-month-old toddler with blonde hair and round cheeks, had been placed in his crib in the upstairs nursery. The family's routine that night was fairly standard. Anne and Charles were at home, and the baby's nurse, Betty Gow, had checked on the boy at around 8 p.m. Everything appeared to be normal. However, around 9 p.m., something happened that no one inside the house heard, or at least no one admitted hearing. A homemade wooden ladder had been placed against the outer wall of the house, reaching up to the nursery window. The ladder was later found broken, with one of its rungs split, possibly under the weight of someone climbing it. Whoever used it had managed to open the unlocked window and enter the nursery without being noticed. The baby was taken from his crib, and no one heard a cry or saw anything suspicious at the time. The first indication that something was wrong came when Betty returned to check on the child shortly after 10 p.m. and found the crib empty. The window was open, and on the windowsill there was a handwritten ransom note. It was poorly written with several spelling mistakes and awkward phrasing. It demanded $50,000 for the return of the child and warned against involving the police or making the matter public. The note was signed with an unusual symbol made up of interlocking circles and lines. Panic set in immediately. Charles Lindbergh, known for his composure in the cockpit, reacted by grabbing a rifle and searching the property. He and others combed the surrounding area, but no sign of the kidnapper was found. The muddy footprints beneath the window led nowhere useful, and the broken ladder and a small chisel left behind offered few clues. Local police were called, and before long, state police and federal agents joined the investigation. The case was so high profile that even J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, took an interest early on. By the next morning, news of the kidnapping had made headlines across the country. Newspapers dubbed it the crime of the century. Radio stations interrupted their usual broadcasts to report on the missing Lindbergh baby. The public was stunned. How could someone kidnap the child of one of the most celebrated men in America from his own home, and do it so silently? The pressure on law enforcement was enormous. Investigators flooded the scene, but the sudden attention created chaos. The home and grounds were swarming with people, including police officers, reporters, and curious neighbors. Much of the potential evidence was disturbed or poorly documented. Forensic science was still in its early stages, and procedures were not what they are today. Mistakes made in those first few hours would later prove significant. As the investigation got underway, suspicions quickly spread. Some believed it had to be an inside job. The house was remote, the window was hard to reach, and the kidnapper had apparently known exactly where to go. Theories circulated that someone from the household staff may have been involved or had leaked information to outsiders. One of the first people questioned was Violet Sharp, a 28-year-old maid employed by Anne's mother. Sharp gave inconsistent statements, and investigators noted her nervous behavior. She was brought in for questioning multiple times, and as pressure mounted, the stress appeared to take a toll. Meanwhile, the ransom negotiations began in an unusual way. A retired schoolteacher from the Bronx, John F. Condon, wrote a letter to a local newspaper offering his services as an intermediary. To the surprise of many, the Lindberghs agreed. Condon began exchanging coded messages with someone claiming to be the kidnapper, using newspaper classifieds to communicate. The messages led to several meetings, the most critical of which took place in a cemetery, where Condon handed over a wooden box containing $50,000 in gold certificates. These notes were traceable, and the serial numbers had been recorded by the authorities. The man who accepted the ransom was described as having a foreign accent and a hoarse voice. Condon would later identify that voice as belonging to the same person he'd dealt with throughout the negotiation process. But despite the ransom being paid, the baby was not returned. Instead, weeks passed with no progress. The Lindberghs were left in a state of limbo, hopeful one day, crushed the next. Then, on May 12th, over 2 months after the abduction, a tragic discovery was made. A truck driver pulled over on the side of a road near Mount Rose, just a few miles from the Lindbergh estate, to relieve himself in the woods. There, among the leaves and underbrush, he spotted something unusual. What he found was the badly decomposed body of a child, partially buried and covered by debris. The skull was fractured, and the body had been damaged by animals. Authorities confirmed that the remains belonged to Charles Lindbergh Jr. The coroner's report indicated the child had likely died the night of the kidnapping, possibly from a blow to the head. This meant the ransom negotiations had taken place while the child was already dead. The news devastated the public. Crowds gathered outside the Lindbergh home, some offering prayers, others simply drawn by the spectacle. Newspapers published emotional images: the empty nursery, the distraught mother, the grieving father. The nation was in shock. A child had been taken and murdered, and the identity of the killer remained a mystery. What made the crime even more disturbing was the seeming lack of motive beyond money. There was no known personal grudge against the Lindberghs, no political message, no note explaining the actions, just a demand for cash and the silent disappearance of a child. The loss of Charles Jr. wasn't just a tragedy for his family. It felt like a loss for the country. Lindbergh had been a hero, and now he was a father facing a nightmare that no amount of fame or influence could prevent. The ransom note found on the nursery windowsill had been hastily written. It demanded $50,000, a significant sum at the time, roughly equivalent to around $1 million today. The note was written in broken English with phrases like, "We warn you for making anything public," which led investigators to believe that the writer may not have been fluent in English. But even that detail couldn't be confirmed. It could just as easily have been someone pretending not to know the language well to throw off the police. Despite the warnings, the case quickly became public. And while law enforcement tried to keep control, the intense media coverage made that nearly impossible. Charles Lindbergh, perhaps used to being in charge as a pilot and public figure, took on a leading role in the investigation. He reviewed ransom notes, authorized decisions, and stayed closely involved in every move. Many saw him as brave and determined, but his hands-on involvement also meant the investigation didn't always follow standard procedure. As the family waited for more contact, a retired schoolteacher from the Bronx named John F. Condon came forward. Condon, who was in his 70s, had read about the case and offered to help in a letter to the Bronx Home News. Surprisingly, Lindbergh accepted the offer. Condon, who began referring to himself as Jafsi, was soon acting as an unofficial go-between. He placed an ad in a New York newspaper, offering to act as an intermediary, and almost immediately a response came. What followed was a series of strange exchanges between Condon and someone claiming to be the kidnapper. They communicated through classified ads and letters, sometimes using coded language. The kidnapper claimed the child was alive and safe but would only be returned after the ransom was paid in full. The amount was raised at one point to $70,000 before dropping back to $50,000. Condon eventually arranged an in-person meeting, which took place on the night of April 2, 1932, in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. It was a dark and eerie location, but Condon went alone, carrying the money in a wooden box filled with gold certificates, bills that were traceable because their serial numbers had been recorded by the authorities. During the meeting, Condon spoke with a man who kept his face hidden in the shadows. The man spoke with a hoarse voice and a foreign accent. Condon later said he was addressed as doctor, and although he couldn't see the man clearly, the voice stayed with him. The exchange was made. The man took the box of money and in return gave Condon a note containing instructions. He claimed the child was being held on a boat called the Nellie off the coast of Massachusetts. Lindbergh and others rushed to check the location, but there was no boat, no crew, and no baby. The tip was a complete fabrication. Despite the failed exchange, the family held on to a sliver of hope. The possibility that the baby was still alive, hidden somewhere and perhaps being used as leverage, kept them going. Days turned into weeks. More letters arrived, sometimes with small personal details that gave them an air of credibility. Then, a particularly cruel note arrived containing a piece of the child's clothing, a small blue woolen sleeping suit. It seemed to confirm that whoever was behind the letters had indeed been in contact with the baby, but it still didn't bring them closer to a rescue. The situation reached its most devastating point on May 12, 1932. It had been over 10 weeks since the child was taken. That day, a truck driver named Orville Wilson pulled off a quiet road near Mount Rose, not far from the Lindbergh estate. He stepped into the woods, likely just looking for a place to relieve himself. But there, beneath the leaves and brush, he saw something unusual, a small form, partially buried in the dirt. What he had found was the body of a child. The body was badly decomposed and animals had disturbed it. Still, police were called immediately. When Lindbergh himself arrived at the scene, he took one look and reportedly said, "That's him." The body was quickly confirmed to be that of Charles Lindbergh Jr. The coroner's examination revealed that the child had likely died the night he was taken. A severe fracture to the skull suggested he had suffered a fatal blow, possibly during the kidnapping itself. Whether it had been accidental or intentional was unclear, but the result was the same. The baby had never stood a chance. The nation went into mourning. Newspapers printed emotional headlines and images of the grieving family. The press ran photos of the empty crib, the broken ladder, and the ransom notes. Many people felt the loss personally, as if it had happened to someone they knew. After all, Lindbergh wasn't just a famous pilot. He was seen as a national treasure. His triumph in 1927 had been a unifying moment for the country. Now he had become the face of a tragedy. The police tried to regain momentum, but their investigation had already suffered from missteps early on. Potential evidence had been disturbed, and suspects had been questioned without solid reasoning. One of the most tragic side effects of the investigation was the death of Violet Sharp. Sharp had been a maid employed by Anne Lindbergh's family. She was brought in for questioning multiple times and reportedly treated harshly by investigators. Her behavior was seen as suspicious. She changed her story, seemed overly anxious, but no solid evidence tied her to the crime. Before she was scheduled for a fourth round of questioning, Violet consumed a toxic dose of silver polish and died within minutes. Her death was ruled a suicide. It shook those close to the case and raised questions about how the investigation was being handled. Later, her alibi for the night of the kidnapping was confirmed. She had been on a date. Her death, it seemed, was a tragic result of pressure and fear, not guilt. Despite the failed ransom exchange and the grim discovery of the child's body, the letters kept coming. A total of 7 ransom notes were eventually received. Most had similar handwriting, and some included details that weren't public, adding credibility to the idea that the writer was involved. But with the baby gone and no suspects in custody, authorities were left chasing ghosts. The use of gold certificates as ransom money was one strategic decision that would later help break the case. These notes, being rare and traceable, were logged with their serial numbers. If someone tried to spend them, it would leave a trail. The plan was simple: wait for someone to use one, then follow the lead. But that process would take time. The notes began to surface slowly across New York, at petrol stations, in shops, at banks. Sometimes weeks would pass without a single hit. Other times, several appeared at once. Each one offered a sliver of hope but rarely led to anything useful. The breakthrough came not from advanced forensics or a dramatic confession, but from something much simpler: money. The $50,000 ransom paid to the kidnapper had been made up of gold certificates. which were still being used in the early 1930s but were already being phased out. Because of this, the government had taken the precaution of recording the serial numbers of every bill in the ransom package. These records were shared with banks, shops, and service stations across the country. Over the following months and years, those certificates slowly began to reappear. One would be used to pay for petrol in Manhattan, another to buy groceries in the Bronx. Each time a note surfaced, investigators would track the transaction, hoping it would lead to someone directly connected to the crime. But most of the notes passed through my hands too quickly. Many people didn't remember where the money had come from. Some transactions had no receipt, and others involved intermediaries who were never found. Then, on September 18, 1934, more than 2 years after the kidnapping, a teller at a Manhattan bank spotted something odd. A man came in to cash a $10 gold certificate. The teller, Walter Lyle, noticed that the bill matched one of the serial numbers from the ransom list. More than that, the man who handed it over seemed uneasy. Something about his demeanor struck Lyle off, and when the man left, he jotted down the license plate number from his car. 4U1341, New York. The information was passed along to the police, who traced the number to a car registered to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a 34-year-old German immigrant living in the Bronx. Hauptmann was a carpenter who had moved to the United States in 1923 after serving time for robbery back in Germany. He had entered the U.S. illegally, stowing away on a ship, and had lived a modest life ever since. At the time of the investigation, he was unemployed, living with his wife Anna and their young son in a small brick house. On September 19th, police showed up at Hauptmann's home. What they found changed the course of the entire case. Hidden in the garage behind boards and inside wooden beams that had been hollowed out, they discovered over $14,000 in gold certificates, ransom money from the Lindbergh case. Some of the notes were still in their original bank wrappers. The money was unmistakable. It was a direct connection to the crime that had shocked the world. Hauptmann was arrested on the spot and taken into custody for questioning. During the search of his home, police also found tools that matched marks left on the wooden ladder used in the kidnapping. Investigators brought in handwriting experts who compared samples of Hauptmann's writing to the ransom notes. According to police reports, similarities were found in letter shapes, spelling patterns, and even the use of certain phrases that had appeared in the ransom letters. 8 handwriting analysts eventually supported the claim that Hauptmann had written the notes. Hauptmann's explanation didn't satisfy authorities. He claimed the money had belonged to a man named Isidor Fisch, a fellow German immigrant and a former business associate. According to Hauptmann, Fisch had given him a shoebox before returning to Germany in late 1933. Fisch died of tuberculosis not long after arriving in Leipzig. Hauptmann said he found the money only after Fisch's death and had decided to keep it. That, he insisted, was the entire story. Investigators weren't convinced. There was no way to confirm whether Fisch had really left the money with Hauptmann, and no other witnesses could back up the claim. Fisch was dead, and his records were limited. Still, the story raised some questions. If Hauptmann really had no involvement in the kidnapping, why hadn't he come forward when he discovered the money? Why hide it in the garage beams instead of turning it in? More importantly, if he was innocent, why was wood from his home found to match the ladder used in the crime? Forensic work carried out at the time wasn't as detailed or reliable as it would be today, but the ladder analysis was seen as a major piece of evidence. Investigators brought in Arthur Kohler, a wood expert from the Forest Products Laboratory in Wisconsin. Kohler traced the wood used in the ladder to a lumberyard in the Bronx where Hauptmann had shopped. More striking, one rail of the ladder appeared to have been made from a piece of floorboard that had been removed from Hauptmann's attic. The cut marks matched perfectly, and tool impressions on the ladder matched carpentry tools found in his garage. The press seized on the story immediately. Once again, newspapers devoted front pages to the case, now with Hauptmann as the central figure. He was labeled the baby killer, even before the trial began. Photographs of him in handcuffs appeared alongside headlines declaring the case solved. But the growing media frenzy brought new complications. The public wanted justice, and many wanted it quickly. Hauptmann, a poor German immigrant with a criminal record and no powerful connections, was an easy target for a public still mourning the death of an American icon's son. His wife, Anna Hauptmann, insisted that her husband was innocent. She claimed he had been home with her on the night of the kidnapping, though she couldn't provide documentation to prove it. She remained vocal and loyal throughout the investigation and trial and would spend much of the rest of her life campaigning to clear his name. The evidence against Hauptmann appeared overwhelming at first glance. The ransom money in his garage, the handwriting analysis, the matching wood, and the vague backstory about Isidore Fish created a narrative that many people found convincing. But cracks in the case began to appear early on. For one, there were no fingerprints on the ladder, in the nursery, or on any of the ransom letters that could tie Hauptmann to the actual crime scene. Not a single physical trace placed him at the Lindbergh estate. And while handwriting experts supported the match, other analysts, consulted later, were more cautious, suggesting that similarities could be coincidental or even a result of bias. Critics also pointed out that much of the investigation had been conducted under heavy media scrutiny, which may have influenced the direction of the case. Hauptmann's arrest quickly led to charges of extortion in New York and murder in New Jersey. With the stakes so high, the case was fast-tracked to trial. But even before the trial began, the question lingered. Was Hauptmann truly the mastermind behind the crime? Or had he somehow come into possession of the ransom money without ever laying a hand on the Lindbergh child? Public opinion didn't leave much room for doubt. The sheer horror of the crime, the kidnapping and death of an innocent child, meant people were desperate for someone to blame. The police had a suspect, the media had a story, and the country had someone to focus its grief and anger on. In January 1935, nearly 3 years after the Lindbergh kidnapping and the tragic death of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann began in Flemington, New Jersey. The small, quiet town quickly became the center of national attention. It wasn't just a criminal case, it was a media spectacle. Some newspapers called it the most important trial of the century, while others described it as a public reckoning. For many Americans, this wasn't just about one man, it was about justice for a nation that had lost something innocent and irreplaceable. The atmosphere outside the courthouse was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Thousands of people arrived in Flemington in the days leading up to the trial. Locals, journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers filled the streets. Vendors sold food and souvenirs. Hotels were booked solid, and people rented out rooms in their homes to visitors. More than 700 journalists were issued press credentials. Reporters from across the country and overseas came to cover the proceedings. Even celebrities made appearances, drawn by the drama and public interest surrounding the case. Inside the courtroom, seating was limited. Spectators packed shoulder to shoulder, hoping for a glimpse of the man accused of committing one of the most disturbing crimes in American history. Bruno Richard Hauptmann sat quietly at the defense table. At 35 years old, he appeared calm but tense. A stocky man with a square face and heavy brow, he didn't speak much, and when he did, it was with a heavy German accent. Throughout the trial, he would remain largely reserved, rarely reacting to the testimony or attention directed his way. The prosecution was led by David T. Willents, the Attorney General of New Jersey. Sharp and composed, Willents knew that the weight of public opinion was on his side. His goal was to show that Hauptmann was not only the man who had taken the ransom money, but also the person who had physically taken the Lindbergh baby from his home and caused his death. The defense, on the other hand, was led by Edward J. Riley, known as Big Ed. Riley was a veteran criminal defense attorney from Brooklyn. He had once been considered one of the top names in his field, but by 1935 he was past his prime. There were rumors that he was struggling with health issues and alcohol. Still, he took the case, and his courtroom style, loud, theatrical, and sometimes erratic, would become one of the more controversial aspects of the trial. The courtroom was packed with tension from the very beginning. The prosecution began with the emotional testimony of Charles Lindbergh himself. Taking the stand on the second day of the trial, Lindbergh spoke quietly but firmly. He recounted the night of the ransom exchange in the Bronx cemetery, describing the man he'd heard speaking to Condon. Gruff voice, foreign accent. When asked whether he recognized the voice again, Lindbergh looked at Hauptmann and said yes. He believed it was the same voice he had heard at the ransom drop nearly 3 years earlier. Anne Morrow Lindbergh also testified. She described the night their child was taken, how she had last seen Charles Jr. in his crib, and how the window was found open later that night. Her testimony was emotional but restrained. Her presence in the courtroom was a reminder of what the case was really about: the death of a child, not just a trial or a spectacle. From there, the prosecution built its case piece by piece. 8 handwriting experts testified that Hauptmann's writing matched the ransom notes. They pointed to specific letter shapes, spelling errors, and even certain phrases, like anything instead of anything, that they claimed were unique to Hauptmann. Then came Arthur Kohler, the wood expert who had examined the ladder used in the kidnapping. His testimony was considered one of the most detailed of the trial. Kohler explained how he had traced the wood in the ladder to a lumber yard in the Bronx, where Hauptmann had purchased wood. One rail of the ladder, Kohler said, matched a missing floorboard from Hauptmann's attic. The wood grain, the tool marks, even the type of nails used, all pointed back to Hauptmann's own home. The prosecution also presented the ransom money found in Hauptmann's garage. Over $14,000 of the original $50,000 was discovered hidden in beams and behind boards. This, according to the state, was undeniable proof of Hauptmann's guilt. But there were problems with the case, and the defense worked hard to highlight them. Riley questioned the lack of physical evidence directly tying Hauptmann to the scene of the crime. There were no fingerprints on the ladder, no eyewitnesses placing him at the Lindbergh estate, and no items belonging to the Lindbergh family found in his home. Riley also pressed the point that Hauptmann had no history of violence or kidnapping. He painted a picture of a man who had come to the United States for a better life, who worked hard as a carpenter, and who had simply made the mistake of holding on to money left to him by a dead acquaintance, Isidor Fisch. Fisch, who had died of tuberculosis in Germany, was central to the defense's argument. Hauptmann said Fisch had left the shoebox of money with him in 1933, and that he hadn't known it was ransom money at the time. The prosecution dismissed the story as fiction. There was no evidence Fisch had ever mentioned the money to anyone else, and no witnesses could support Hauptmann's version of events. Hauptmann himself testified for several days. Under cross-examination, he stuck to his story. He was calm, but occasionally appeared nervous. When asked why he had hidden the money or spent it slowly over time, he offered vague answers, saying he had hoped to invest it later. He repeatedly insisted that he had nothing to do with the kidnapping or the death of Charles Lindbergh Jr. The trial lasted 5 weeks. A total of 162 witnesses were called, and the jury sat through 32 days of testimony. The public remained glued to the coverage. Newspapers ran daily front-page stories, some openly suggesting that Hauptmann was guilty before the jury had even deliberated. In the streets outside the courthouse, people carried signs demanding the death penalty. It was clear that public opinion had already made up its mind. On February 13, 1935, the jury returned its verdict after 11 hours of deliberation. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to death. As the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Hauptmann showed little emotion. Outside, however, people cheered. The case that had haunted the country for 3 years had, at least in the eyes of the public, come to an end. But the story didn't stop there. Almost immediately, appeals were filed. Hauptmann's lawyers argued that the trial had been biased, that evidence had been mishandled, and that the intense media pressure had made a fair trial impossible. The case went to the New Jersey Court of Errors and Appeals, where a panel of 18 judges reviewed the decision. In June 1935, they upheld the conviction by a vote of 13-5. Then something unexpected happened. The governor of New Jersey, Harold G. Hoffman, began to express doubts about Hauptmann's guilt. Hoffman was not a typical politician. He was outspoken and willing to challenge public opinion. He visited Hauptmann in prison, reviewed the case files, and even launched a private investigation into how the original trial had been handled. Hoffman believed there were unanswered questions. Why had certain leads been dropped? Why were some witnesses ignored? And why had the defense been so poorly managed? He didn't claim Hauptmann was innocent outright, but he did suggest that the crime may have involved more than one person, and that the investigation had been rushed to satisfy public demand. Despite Hoffman's efforts, the Board of Pardons refused to grant Hauptmann a new trial. On April 3, 1936, Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair at New Jersey State Prison. He declined a final meal and maintained his innocence until the end. His last words, spoken in a low voice to the witnesses in the room, were reportedly, "I am absolutely innocent of the crime for which I am about to die." Charles Lindbergh did not attend the execution. He had remained largely silent in public during the final months of the case. After the execution, he and Anne moved abroad for several years, seeking privacy and distance from the media storm that had consumed their lives. Even after the trial ended and Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed, the case of the Lindbergh kidnapping refused to fade. For many, the conviction had brought a sense of closure. A man had been found guilty, justice was seen to be done, and the nation could move on. But not everyone was convinced. In fact, some believed the trial had closed too neatly, too quickly. Over time, doubts began to grow, and new theories started to emerge. Some grounded in overlooked details, others more speculative, even shocking. One of the first cracks in the official story was the lack of physical evidence placing Hauptmann at the scene of the crime. No fingerprints were ever found on the ladder used in the kidnapping or in the nursery where the baby was taken. No one saw him at the Lindbergh estate. Despite the fact that his house contained over $14,000 of the ransom money, there was nothing directly connecting him to the act itself. Then there was the ladder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of Arthur Kohler, the wood expert who traced part of the ladder to wood in Hauptmann's attic. It was persuasive, but not without problems. Kohler admitted that the type of wood was common and that many carpenters could have had access to similar materials. The connection to Hauptmann's attic was more specific, but the conclusion depended on visual comparisons and grain patterns, not exactly foolproof. And crucially, no fibers or prints linked the ladder to Hauptmann beyond the wood itself. The handwriting evidence, too, raised questions. 8 experts had testified that Hauptmann's writing matched that of the ransom notes. But other analysts, including respected figures like Albert Osborne, gave more cautious opinions, saying it was possible but not certain. Handwriting analysis even now isn't a perfect science. Back then, with limited technology and high public pressure, it was even more open to interpretation. The money in Hauptmann's garage remained the strongest piece of evidence against him, but even that didn't fit together perfectly. If Hauptmann had really kidnapped and murdered the Lindbergh baby for ransom, why hold on to the money for more than 2 years? And why spend it so slowly, just a few dollars at a time? His defense team argued that someone who had committed such a major crime would likely try to launder or get rid of the money, not keep it hidden in his garage. The story he told that he got the money from a man named Isidor Fish sounded unlikely, but Fish was a real person, and he had died in Germany before he could be questioned. There was no clear evidence proving or disproving Hauptmann's version of events. Then there was the issue of whether the crime could have been committed by one person alone. The ladder found at the scene was over 15 feet long and made in 3 separate parts. Carrying it, setting it up, climbing it, and then exiting with a 30-pound child, all without being seen or heard, was a big ask for a single person. One of the rungs on the ladder had broken during the crime, and experts later said it could have snapped under the weight of 2 people. But either way, the logistics of the kidnapping didn't seem simple. Governor Harold Hoffman, who had expressed doubt even before Hauptmann's execution, openly questioned whether Hauptmann could have acted alone. He believed the investigation had been rushed and too focused on a single suspect. After Hauptmann's death, Hoffman continued to suggest that the case hadn't been fully solved. That idea, that others may have been involved, opened the door to even more theories. Some pointed to the mob, suggesting that organized crime figures might have planned the kidnapping for ransom. The early 1930s were a peak time for gang activity in the United States, and there were other high-profile kidnappings during that period. Could a gang have been involved, with Hauptmann as just one part of a larger plan? Others looked closer to home. Violet Sharp, the maid who had worked for Anne Lindbergh's family, had killed herself after being questioned repeatedly by police. Her alibi was eventually confirmed, but her fear and anxiety raised suspicions. Some believed she may have known something more than she admitted, perhaps even unintentionally helped someone gain access to the estate. Her fiancé later claimed she had been terrified before her death, but no further investigation was made. The media frenzy at the time also influenced how the case was viewed. From the moment of Hauptmann's arrest, newspapers ran stories calling him the Lindbergh baby killer and painting him as guilty before a trial had even begun. His background, German, poor with a criminal record, made him an easy target in the eyes of a public desperate for someone to blame. The press pressure was immense, and some jurors later admitted to feeling unsafe during the trial. One even received a brick through her window with a threat. Others recalled the intensity of the trial atmosphere and the difficulty of staying impartial. Then, there was a theory that shocked many and continues to provoke debate. What if Charles Lindbergh himself knew more than he let on? In 2004, historian Lloyd Gardner published The Case That Never Dies, raising the possibility that Lindbergh had played a role in what happened to his son. Gardner wasn't alone in questioning Lindbergh's behavior during the investigation. From the very beginning, Lindbergh had taken full control, delaying FBI involvement, choosing which leads to follow, and personally identifying his son's body with minimal examination. He insisted on having the child's body cremated soon after the discovery, which meant no second autopsy could be performed. To some, this looked like a grieving father trying to move on. To others, it raised red flags. Lindbergh was also known to have had strong beliefs in eugenics, the controversial idea that certain traits, such as intelligence or physical ability, should be preserved or improved through selective breeding. Charles Jr., the Lindbergh baby, was reportedly not in perfect health. Some accounts suggest he may have had rickets or other developmental issues, and that Lindbergh was concerned about his son's future. Could those beliefs have played a role in how the tragedy unfolded? There is no solid evidence supporting the idea that Lindbergh staged or allowed the kidnapping to happen. But some writers have pointed out unusual decisions, like his insistence that the baby not be disturbed after 7:30 p.m. on the night of the kidnapping, or his role in managing the investigation so closely. These details alone don't prove anything, but they continue to fuel suspicion. Decades after the trial, new books and documentaries continued to explore alternative theories. Some called the investigation flawed, while others suggested Hauptmann had been framed. One argument was that law enforcement had been under intense pressure to produce a suspect quickly and had built a case that looked good on paper, even if it didn't hold up to deeper scrutiny. What's certain is that the Lindbergh case was a turning point in American legal history. It led to the federal government becoming more involved in kidnapping cases, including the passing of the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal offense. It also showed how powerful public opinion could be and how quickly it could shape the outcome of a trial. As time passed, more people came to question the verdict. Hauptmann's wife spent the rest of her life insisting on his innocence. Historians, journalists, and authors continued to dig through the case, trying to make sense of it. Some believed that the system got it right. Others were convinced that a miscarriage of justice had taken place. Even today, nearly a century later, the case still divides opinion. What remains is a story with too many unanswered questions. A child taken and killed under mysterious circumstances. A suspect who maintained his innocence until his final breath. A nation desperate for justice. And a legacy of doubt that refuses to disappear.